In this module, we'll take a look at the last piece of the interface. Even though it's the simplest, it's also one of the most important. It's the timeline, and it transports us around our animation as we work. The timeline is located at the bottom of the viewer panel, and it allows us to adjust the playback settings, including the frame range, selecting the playback mode, and locking the view panel's playback range. This little orange triangle is the frame indicator. You can drag the frame indicator along the timeline to quickly skip to the specific frame you want to view. So if you left mouse button click on this little guy, you can just grab him and drag him to any frame you want along the animation and jump right to that frame. Now when you do that, the current frame will appear in the middle of the timeline here. You can use this frame indicator in the middle of the timeline to enter a specific frame you want to jump to as well. So if I go down here, I can just put frame 50 in here and we'll jump ahead to frame 50. This frame indicator also takes simple equations. So if you have to jump ahead 25 frames or jump back 25 frames from your current frame, you can just type in plus 25 or minus 25 into this field and it'll do the operation for you. So if I hit negative 25, it's going to jump that cursor back 25 frames on the timeline. So to go back to where we were, I'll do plus 25, and that's about as simple as it gets. If you put an equation in here like 10 plus 20, it won't do that. It'll only be able to handle moving the cursor negative frames or positive frames in either the left or the right direction. I should take a second to point out too that Nuke by default is automatically adjusting the timeline of your viewer panel to show the frame range defined by your project settings. So if you see down here that the frame range is between frames 1 and frames 200, it's drawing that information from your project settings. So at any time, if you're in the node graph, you can hit the S button and it'll bring up the properties for your entire workflow in the properties panel. And down here we have a frame range that's 1 to 200. So if I put 300 in here, Nuke is going to automatically adjust the timeline to be a frame range of 1 to 300 instead. If there's a specific piece of animation we want to zoom in on, you can just right click down here in the timeline and drag a cursor out. And Nuke will automatically zoom into the frame range you've defined. If you want to zoom in even further, you can just grab it and zoom in even further. Now, if you want to get back out to the global view again, you should know that there's a drop-down menu right here where this word visible is. If I click on this, it gives me a couple of options: global, input, in and out, and visible. So right now it's just showing us the visible range, and that's the user-defined range that we just zoomed in on. If I go back to global, it's going to reset the slider back to the global settings, and like we just said, the global settings are defined by the properties menu. Likewise, we can set this to the input range. So if I select input, it's going to reset the timeline to be the input range, and that is basically if you have a read node in your scene, or if you have a read node selected, it's going to adjust the timeline to be the amount of time that's contained inside that read node. And that of course brings us to the next option, which is in and out. So if I select in and out, basically it's going to give us a frame range that's defined by our ins and our outs. And that brings me to these two buttons here. This button is an in button, and this button is your out button. And we can define what frames we want to be our in and out buttons by selecting a frame and then hitting that in button to drop the in marker. And then if I go to frame 150, for example, I can hit the out button and clip it in the out range. So if we skip back to the global range, you'll see that these orange bars have appeared where we've defined our in and our out frames. Our in frame being 50 and our out frame being 150. So when you've sequestered a frame range like that, and you use these VCR buttons at the bottom of the display panel, your viewer is going to be working within that specified range. So if I hit play and I do playback within this range, it's going to stop at my out, just like that, and repeat where my in is. So right now we've just basically defined a temporary frame range in which we're working. This becomes important in production because there might be a specific set of frames that you want to look at over and over and over again to see glitching animation. And if you can just tell Nuke to calculate those specific frames, you can play them back in a loop like this and modify your work and play them back and modify your work until you get the animation the way that you want it to look. So I'll stop this and I'll point out this little button here that's now been highlighted red. This little button is just to tell us that we've locked the viewer in a playback range. So whenever we define an in and an out and lock our viewer within a playback range, this button's going to highlight. And we can just turn that off by clicking here. And now our playback will go beyond the range that we previously specified. And you can always just bring that back by clicking on this and going back to the in and out mode. I'd also like to point out this menu here, which lets you toggle between frames and timecode. So if you're more comfortable working in timecode, you can just set this option to timecode, and you'll get your timecode on the timeline instead of frames. If you're more comfortable with frames, just stick to the frame range. We also have these incrementing buttons down here, and they just let you skip forward and backward in the timeline by however many frames you want to define. So if I'm on frame 150 and this is set to 10, this is just going to bounce between intervals of 10 on the timeline. I can set this to 50 frames and it's going to bounce by increments of 50 on the timeline. So now let's take a look at flip booking. And flip booking just lets us view a range of frames in real time. So it's going to render out those frames that we want to take a look at, and it's going to play them back as a movie file that plays at real time. When we hit play on the timeline down here, you can see that this is far from real time because it's calculating the frames as it goes. And as your comps get much bigger than this, that speed will slow down as well. So if we want to see these frames played back at 24 frames per second, which is a standard for animation, we can flip book things. And we do that by clicking on this button here. And this will bring up your flip book settings. So if we take a look at these flip book settings, this is going to be our default flip book. We're going to be rendering out viewer 1, which corresponds to our viewer 1 right here. You can click this button on or click this button off to use a region of interest, which we talked about in a previous clip. So if we want to, we can render out a single range of pixels that we define with the ROI button. This is our frame range, so if we want to see between frames 50 and frames 100, we select that there. Render in the background is useful sometimes. That just means that it's going to run this flip booking process in the background as a separate thread. You can check that on or not, that's up to you. If you have an audio node in your scene, like we've looked at in previous clips and previous modules, you can select it here. This current comp doesn't have one, so we'll just say none, and I'm gonna hit OK here. And now it's gonna render those frames. So I'm gonna come back in a second when this render's done, and we're gonna take a look at the flip book. Okay, we're back, and we have our flip book. And if you take a look at it, it's playing back this camera shake node in real time. So this is what our animation currently looks like. So that's basically all you have to know about the viewer. In the next module, we'll take a look at doing a real life Nuke comp. We're going to take this image of Earth and we're going to put it together for you. We're going to put it on top of a star field. And we're going to use some nodes that we haven't seen before and just put together a general comp so you can see what a workflow looks like in Nuke and get started.